Johnstown, Pennsylvania, looked like any other hard-working industrial town in the late 1800s. Around 30,000 people lived there. Families worked hard, raised their kids, and went about their daily lives. Nobody woke up thinking their entire town could disappear before dinner. Then the rain started. It rained for 4 straight days. Not a light spring rain, but the kind that never seems to stop. Every creek turned into a river. Every river kept getting bigger. The mountains around Johnstown were soaking up as much water as they could until they simply couldn't hold anymore. High above the town sat South Fork Lake. Most people knew the lake existed, but that was about it. It was owned by a private fishing and hunting club made up of some of the richest men in America. To the people living below, it was just another lake in the hills. No one thought much about it. No one imagined that millions of tons of water were being held back by a single earthen dam. The truth was terrifying. Without realizing it, the people of Johnstown were living directly beneath what was basically a giant wall of water. If that dam ever failed, there would be almost no time to escape. On the morning of the 31st of May 1889, one man noticed something was seriously wrong. His name was John Park Jr. He was only 23 years old, a civil engineer responsible for watching over the South Fork Dam. The day before, everything had looked manageable. There was still plenty of space between the lake and the top of the dam. But when he returned that morning, the picture had completely changed. The water had risen at an unbelievable rate overnight. What had been a safe margin was now almost gone. The lake wasn't just getting higher, it was pushing hard against the dam. Park immediately understood what most people couldn't see. This wasn't just heavy rain anymore. The lake was trying to break free. As he inspected the dam, he found another serious problem. The spillway, which was supposed to let excess water flow out safely, was clogged with debris. Branches, logs, and floating wood had piled up against metal fish screens that had been installed years earlier to keep fish inside the lake. Instead of protecting the dam, those screens were trapping everything that should have been flowing away. The water had nowhere to go. Walking across the top of the dam, Park later said he could actually feel the ground moving beneath his boots. The soaked earth was beginning to shift under the incredible pressure. For an engineer, that's the kind of feeling you never forget. It's the moment you realize a structure isn't just under stress anymore. It's starting to fail. At that point, John Park knew the danger was real. The question was no longer whether the situation was serious. It was whether anyone could stop what was coming. Here's what really stood out to me. The South Fork Dam wasn't some poorly built structure from the beginning. In fact, when Pennsylvania built it back in the 1850s, it was considered solid engineering. It was designed to hold back a huge lake and supply water to the state's canal system. The engineers knew exactly what they were doing. One of the smartest features was a set of 5 large discharge pipes built into the base of the dam. If the lake ever got too high, those pipes could slowly drain the water in a controlled way. It wasn't fast, but it gave people options during an emergency. That's what good engineering is all about, planning for the worst before it happens. Then everything changed. A group of wealthy businessmen from Pittsburgh bought the property. They weren't interested in running a reservoir. They wanted a private getaway where they could fish, relax, and entertain friends. That's when they started making changes. At first, those changes probably didn't seem like a big deal. They lowered the top of the dam by about 3 feet, so horse-drawn carriages could cross it more easily between the clubhouse and the boathouse. 3 feet doesn't sound like much, but for a dam, it meant losing a huge amount of safety. Suddenly, there was much less room before water could spill over the top. Then, they made an even bigger mistake. They removed all 5 discharge pipes and sold the iron as scrap. Just think about that for a second. The one system designed to lower the lake during an emergency was gone. From that point on, there was no practical way to reduce the water level if heavy rain filled the reservoir. The lake could only empty by flowing over the spillway, and they weren't done. To keep their stocked bass and trout from escaping, they installed heavy iron fish screens across the spillway. It probably sounded like a smart idea for a private fishing club. But during storms, those screens trapped branches, logs, and floating debris. Instead of letting water escape, they slowly turned the spillway into a giant blockage. Water kept coming in. Less and less water could get out. That's exactly the situation you never want with a dam. What surprises me most is that none of this happened in secret. These weren't unavoidable accidents. They were deliberate choices, made one after another, all for convenience. Even worse, the club never hired an independent engineer to inspect the dam after making those modifications. Not once in the 10 years they owned it. No outside safety review. No professional inspection. No one asking the hard questions. The dam still looked strong from the outside, and that gave everyone a false sense of security. But underneath, the safety margin had been shrinking year after year. By the time the rain finally came in the spring of 1889, the real damage had already been done. The storm didn't create the disaster. It simply exposed years of bad decisions that had been quietly building toward one terrible day. This is the part that really gets to me. The disaster wasn't impossible to predict. In fact, people saw it coming years before the dam finally failed. One of those people was Daniel J. Morrell, the president of Cambria Iron. He wasn't some random critic looking for attention. He understood engineering, and he knew exactly what was sitting above Johnstown. He looked at the South Fork Dam and became worried. So he did something most people would call reasonable. He personally wrote to the owners of the dam and asked if his engineers could inspect it. He even offered to pay for the inspection himself. If repairs were needed, he said he would cover those costs too. He wasn't asking for ownership. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He simply wanted to make sure the dam was safe. The answer came back quickly. No. The club told him the dam was in good condition and that no inspection was necessary. That was the end of the conversation. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder what might have happened if they had just said yes. Years passed. Nothing changed. Then came the endless rain in May of 1889. As the water kept rising, John Park Jr., the young engineer responsible for watching the dam, realized the situation was becoming critical. He didn't waste time hoping things would somehow get better. He acted. Park rode down through the mud to the telegraph office and sent 3 urgent messages. The first was sent to Robert Pitcairn, the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He warned that the dam could fail within hours. The second went to the railroad yard at East Conemaugh, telling them to stop trains and prepare for danger. Both of those messages were delivered. The railroad took them seriously. But the third message was the one that mattered most. It was addressed to the officials in Johnstown, the people living directly below the dam. For reasons that have never been fully explained, that telegram never reached the town's leaders. No warning was passed on. No evacuation was ordered. No church bells rang. No one went door to door telling families to leave. Most people in Johnstown kept living their normal Friday afternoon. Children played outside. Workers finished their shifts. Families were getting ready for the evening. They had no idea a wall of water was already threatening to race toward them. Even more frustrating, no later investigation ever found a clear answer for why that final telegram disappeared. The question was never seriously pursued. That missing message has become one of the biggest mysteries of the entire disaster. Maybe it wouldn't have saved everyone. The flood moved incredibly fast, but even a few extra minutes could have meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. That's what makes this story so difficult to forget. Sometimes history isn't shaped by what people don't know. It's shaped by the warnings that never reach the people who need them most. By early afternoon, everyone working on the dam knew they were running out of time. The rain hadn't stopped. The lake kept rising. Every minute brought more pressure against the earthen wall. John Park Jr. was back on top of the dam, watching it as closely as he could. Then something happened that every engineer fears. He heard a strange sound. Not a loud explosion, not a crack. He described it as a slow hiss, followed by a deep rumble coming from beneath his feet. It was the sound of the dam itself beginning to give way. Then he saw it. The middle section of the dam started to sink. In just a few seconds, the top dropped by nearly 2 feet. That may not sound like much, but on a structure holding back an entire lake, it meant disaster had already begun. Water immediately rushed over the low spot. The workers had been digging a second spillway with shovels, hoping to relieve some of the pressure. But by then, it was clear they were fighting a battle they couldn't win. The lake was simply too powerful. At exactly 3:10 that afternoon, the South Fork Dam finally gave way. The first opening wasn't huge, but under that much pressure, it didn't need to be. The rushing water tore through the weak spot, ripping away more earth every second. Within about a minute and a half, the narrow gap had exploded into a massive breach more than 100 feet wide. There was nothing left to stop it. An estimated 20 million tons of water burst through the opening and charged into the valley below. It didn't trickle out. It didn't slowly overflow. It exploded forward like a giant wall, driven by gravity and the unbelievable weight of the lake behind it. The water was freezing cold, nearly 40 feet high in places, and moving faster than most people could ever run. Everything in its path, trees, rocks, fences, and pieces of the dam itself was swept into the growing wall of destruction. From that moment on, nothing could stop it. The people living downstream had almost no warning. Some never saw the flood coming. Others heard a distant roar that grew louder every second. Survivors later said it sounded less like water and more like an entire mountain collapsing. What they were hearing wasn't just a flood. It was years of ignored warnings, bad decisions, and neglected safety rushing toward them all at once. The storm didn't destroy Johnstown that afternoon. The dam had already been weakened long before the rain ever arrived. The rain simply pushed it past the point where it could never recover. And once that wall of water was free, the disaster was no longer a possibility. It became history. Once the dam broke, there was no stopping what came next. A wall of water, nearly 35 to 40 feet high, thundered down the valley. It wasn't just water anymore. It was moving with incredible force, picking up everything in its path: trees, huge boulders, pieces of the dam, entire buildings. The wave grew larger with every mile it traveled. The first place it reached was the small town of South Fork, just below the dam. People barely had time to react. Some heard a deep roar echoing through the valley. Others looked up and saw what looked like a moving wall stretching from one side of the valley to the other. Within moments, houses were ripped from their foundations. Streets disappeared. Families were swept away before they even understood what was happening. The wave didn't slow down. A few miles later, it slammed into Mineral Point. It was a small community, but the destruction was total. Homes collapsed almost instantly. Many people never had the chance to escape. By the time the water moved on, much of the town had simply vanished. Then came East Conemaugh. This is where one man's quick thinking saved countless lives. Railroad engineer John Hess heard the sound of the approaching flood before he ever saw it. After 20 years working on the railroad, he knew this wasn't an ordinary storm. He immediately backed his locomotive through town with the whistle blowing non-stop. That screaming whistle became the only warning many people ever received. Families dropped what they were doing and ran for higher ground. Later estimates suggested that without those few minutes of warning, hundreds more people could have died. Even so, the flood still claimed dozens of lives there. The locomotive itself was eventually picked up and thrown aside like a toy. But the wave still wasn't finished. Next came Woodvale. By then, the flood had transformed into something almost impossible to describe. Survivors didn't call it a wave of water. They called it a wave of buildings. Entire houses were crashing into one another. Railroad cars, factory machinery, giant trees, livestock, and pieces of bridges were all tangled together inside one massive wall moving at incredible speed. Everything became a weapon. When the flood tore through the Cambria ironworks, it smashed storage tanks filled with lubricating oil. The oil spilled across the rushing water and continued downstream, setting the stage for an even greater tragedy later that evening. Then, at around 4:07 p.m., the wave reached Johnstown. By now, it stretched nearly a quarter of a mile across and still stood close to 40 feet high. People who saw it coming struggled to describe what they witnessed. Some thought it looked like a giant black cloud rolling across the ground. Others said the sound was so powerful they could actually feel it shaking inside their chest before the water arrived. Then it hit. In about 10 minutes, the city was gone. Homes, churches, schools, businesses, Factories, everything people had spent years building was torn apart almost instantly. The streets disappeared beneath a violent mix of water, mud, timber, steel, and debris. Thousands of lives changed forever in less time than it takes to watch the evening news. That's the part that stays with me. Johnstown wasn't destroyed little by little. It was erased almost all at once. 10 minutes. That's all it took for an entire city to become a field of wreckage. You'd think the nightmare ended once the water finally slowed down. It didn't. In many ways, the worst part was just beginning. About a mile downstream from the center of Johnstown stood the Pennsylvania Railroad's massive stone bridge. It had been built only a year earlier with huge sandstone arches designed to withstand almost anything. And it did. The bridge never collapsed. Instead, it became a trap. Everything the flood had ripped apart came crashing into it. Houses, railroad cars, factory beams, trees, wagons, furniture, pieces of entire neighborhoods. Nothing could get through. Minute by minute, the pile grew larger. By late afternoon, it had become a mountain of debris stretching across the river. Some estimates said it covered nearly 40 acres and stood as high as 70 feet in places. Buried inside that tangled mess were people. Not everyone had died in the flood. Around 80 people were still alive, trapped beneath broken walls, heavy timbers, and twisted wreckage. Survivors nearby could hear them calling for help. Some shouted, some cried out for family members. Others simply begged someone to pull them out. But reaching them was almost impossible. Then the situation became even worse. Earlier, when the flood tore through the Cambria ironworks, it had smashed large storage tanks filled with lubricating oil. That oil spread across the surface of the water and collected around the enormous debris pile at the bridge. The river itself had become coated with fuel. At about 6 that evening, a fire broke out. No one knows exactly what started it. It could have been a burning stove carried from someone's home, a lantern, a rescue worker's torch. Maybe several things happened at once. In the end, it didn't matter. The oil caught fire almost immediately. Within minutes, flames raced through the entire debris pile. Survivors later said the heat felt like standing next to the blast furnaces at the iron mill. The fire spread so fast that there was no chance to rescue the people trapped inside. Those desperate voices that had been calling for help slowly disappeared. One by one, they fell silent. The flames didn't burn for a few hours. They burned for nearly 3 full days. Even the water couldn't stop them. In one of the most horrifying scenes anyone could imagine, the river itself was on fire. Think about that for a second. People who had somehow survived one of the deadliest floods in American history were now surrounded by burning oil and blazing wreckage. Some escaped the water, only to lose their lives in the fire that followed. That's the part of this tragedy that stays with me the most. The flood destroyed the city in minutes, but the fire made sure the suffering didn't end there. For 3 long days, families could do nothing but watch the flames consume what was left of their homes and the people they loved. The stone bridge stood exactly as it was designed to. Everything else failed. When the flood finally ended, Johnstown didn't even look like a town anymore. It looked like a battlefield. Homes were gone. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Families were searching through mud and broken wood, hoping to find someone they loved. A few days later, help finally arrived. One of the first people on the scene was Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. She reached Johnstown with trained volunteers, medical supplies, food, and clothing. She didn't stay for a few days and leave. She remained there for months, helping organize what became one of the first large-scale disaster relief efforts in American history. For many survivors, she represented the first real sign that they weren't facing this tragedy alone. But even with all that help, some wounds could never heal. The recovery was heartbreaking. Bodies were found everywhere. Some were buried beneath the wreckage at the stone bridge. Others were pulled from the mud weeks later. Some drifted more than 40 miles downstream before they were discovered. In the end, 2,209 people were confirmed dead. What makes that number even harder to accept is this. About 750 victims could never be identified. There was simply no way to know who they were anymore. They were buried together in what's now known as the Plot of the Unknown at Grandview Cemetery. Hundreds of identical markers stand there today, reminding visitors that many families never got the chance to say a proper goodbye. Then came the court cases. Families wanted answers. They believed the owners of the South Fork Dam should be held responsible. After all, the club owned the dam. They had changed it. They had ignored warnings. And those decisions had ended thousands of lives. That seemed like a straightforward argument. But the courtroom saw it differently. The defense claimed the disaster was an act of God. Their argument was simple. The rainfall had been unusually heavy, so the flood was a natural event beyond human control. Under the law at that time, if something was officially considered an act of God, the owners could not be held legally responsible. The court agreed. One lawsuit after another failed. Not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ordered to pay damages to the families who had lost everything. Not one. That's the part many people still struggle to understand. Warnings had been ignored. Safety features had been removed. Inspection requests had been rejected. Yet no one was legally responsible. As if that wasn't frustrating enough, another mystery only added to the questions. Over the years, several important records connected to the disaster disappeared. Reports, meeting minutes, engineering notes, and other key documents were said to have been destroyed in fires at the clubhouse. Those fires were never fully explained. Whether it was bad luck, coincidence, or something else, we'll probably never know. But it meant that some of the most important evidence simply vanished. When I look back at this story, what stays with me isn't just the flood itself. It's what happened afterward. Thousands of families buried their loved ones. Hundreds never even learned where those loved ones ended up. And the people whose decisions helped create the disaster walked away without ever facing legal consequences. Sometimes, the hardest part of history isn't the tragedy. It's realizing that justice doesn't always arrive with the rescue crews. You'd hope a disaster like Johnstown would never happen again. In some ways, it changed everything. After years of public outrage and hard lessons, states across the country slowly began passing stronger dam safety laws. Pennsylvania eventually introduced one of the first modern dam inspection programs in the United States. Over time, regular inspections, engineering reviews, and stricter safety standards became much more common. Those changes happened because thousands of people had already paid the price. But here's the part that surprised me. The story doesn't really end in 1889. Even today, the United States still has thousands of dams classified as high hazard potential. That doesn't mean they're all about to fail. It means that if one of them ever did fail, people would almost certainly lose their lives. Many of those dams are decades old. Some are older than the South Fork Dam was when it collapsed. And history has shown that this isn't just an old problem. In 2020, after days of heavy rain, 2 dams failed in central Michigan within hours of each other. More than 10,000 people had to evacuate their homes, and the damage reached hundreds of millions of dollars. Thankfully, far fewer lives were lost than in Johnstown. But the warning signs sounded familiar. Reports showed that safety concerns had been raised for years before the failure. Repairs had been delayed. Problems were known long before the disaster happened. That pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. When I think about Johnstown, I don't see it as a story about one unlucky storm. I see it as a story about small decisions that kept piling up. One shortcut, one delayed repair, one ignored inspection, one warning that wasn't taken seriously. By themselves, none of those choices seemed big enough to destroy a city. Together, they became a disaster. That's probably the biggest lesson this story leaves behind. People often call events like this natural disasters. But the rain wasn't the only reason Johnstown was destroyed. Rain was simply the final trigger. The real damage had been building for years through human decisions. Every safety feature that was removed, every inspection that never happened, every warning that was brushed aside. Those choices mattered long before the storm arrived. That's why this story still feels relevant today. Technology has improved. Engineering has improved. Safety laws are much stronger than they were in the 1800s. But human nature hasn't changed very much. It's still easy to postpone repairs. It's still tempting to save money instead of fixing a problem. It's still possible to believe that because something hasn't failed yet, it never will. Johnstown reminds us how dangerous that way of thinking can be. The flood wasn't really caused by one afternoon of heavy rain. It was caused by years of decisions that slowly erased the margin for error until there was nothing left. And maybe that's the question every community should ask, not whether a disaster is possible, but whether someone is making the right decisions today to keep it from happening tomorrow. Conclusion: the dam wasn't the only thing that broke. After learning everything that happened in Johnstown, I don't think the rain was the real cause of the disaster. The rain was just the final push. Nature didn't lower the dam. Nature didn't remove the safety pipes. Nature didn't ignore the warnings or decide that convenience mattered more than safety. People made those decisions. And that's the lesson I keep coming back to. The biggest disasters rarely begin with one dramatic moment. They usually start with small choices that seem harmless at the time. One shortcut, one delayed repair, one warning that's brushed aside because nothing bad has happened yet. Then one day, all those decisions come due at once. That's exactly what happened in Johnstown. More than a century has passed, but the story still feels relevant today. Whenever safety takes a back seat to profit, whenever experts are ignored, or whenever someone assumes it'll be fine, the same pattern begins all over again. So maybe the most important question isn't, could this dam fail? The better question is, has someone with the knowledge, the authority, and the courage to say this isn't safe actually inspected it before it's too late? Because history shows that disasters don't become tragedies simply because nature is powerful. They become tragedies when people stop listening before nature has the final word.